With this in mind, can I ask the Secretary of State what steps his department is taking to protect the mental health of GP and NHS workers?
The Honourable Lady is right to raise this. So healthcare workers, whether GPs or others, have been under significant pressure over the last 2 years especially, and of course that is applied to GPs. The support that we provided through the Winter Access Fund is there, the 250 million to support GP surgeons across the country, including support with workforce.
My hospital trust is looking to redesign services, ophthalmology and cardiology across its 2 hospitals, Eastbourne District General and Hastings Conquest. The trust puts forward an important clinical case for the change, but the reality of the road, the distance, the public transport options, it can be 2 hours and 2 buses for the 1 in 4 households in Eastbourne that doesn't have a car, means that any change can present a very real problem and create issues for local people. Ahead of his visit to Eastbourne, would my honourable friend meet with me here to discuss this vital question of access to hospital services?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to my honourable friend. Public consultation on the reconfiguration in East Sussex was launched on the 6th of December last year and will close on the 11th of March. She's absolutely right to highlight access and transport links as being a key factor in such decisions, and I'd of course be delighted to meet her.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, only 9% of people in low-income countries have received 1 vaccine dose, yet the UK government's delivered less than a third of its pledged contributions to COVAX. So given no one is safe till everyone is safe, what assessments has the Secretary of State made of the risk to public health from emerging variants from the unvaccinated worldwide? And will he ensure that all doses pledged will be delivered to COVAX by the end of June? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the UK has worked from the start of the pandemic to support equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, helping to establish the International Joint Procurement Initiative, COVAX, to support both higher and lower income countries to secure vaccines they need. And as my right honourable friend has already indicated, that we are committed to delivering the 100 million doses by mid-June, and we've already delivered over 30 million doses by the end of 2021. And the UK leads the way through the UK HSA in variants and are willing to progress that technology throughout the world.
Mr. Speaker, the building of the Women and Children's Hospital at Royal Cornwall Hospital has been a key promise of this government and something the Secretary of State's predecessor was very supportive of. Can my right honourable friend reaffirm the department's commitment to this building and agree to meet with me to ensure that everything is being done to get this vital project delivered on time?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We remain fully committed to the delivery of the important new Women and Children's Hospital in Truro for the Royal Cornwall Hospitals NHS Trust as part of our new hospital programme, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, remains committed to it. And of course, I would be delighted to meet with her.
John Morrow. Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, I hope you are watching Georgie Hospital, the Channel 4 series that follows the talented, highly skilled, dedicated and wonderfully witty staff of Newcastle Hospitals Trust. But I hope the Secretary of State recognises that, as well as a great sense of humour, as we enter our 3rd pandemic year following a decade of underinvestment and low pay, and with staff shortages, absences and NHS waiting lists all rising, what the NHS staff need is a long-term workforce plan, and will he bring it forward?
Yeah. Well, first, Mr. Speaker, I would commend everyone working in Newcastle Hospital Trust and across the NHS for everything that they're doing. And she's right to talk about the importance of workforce. That's why we have asked Health Education England to come up with a 15-year workforce framework. But she knows that also what makes a big difference is the resources the NHS has, and it would have helped if she had supported the government's record investment of £36 billion over the next 3 years in the NHS and social care.
Any more?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend tell the House how he's making it easy for transport workers who are disproportionately under-vaccinated to get their jabs and get this country moving?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And we are intent on making vaccines as accessible as possible. Hence, there are now more vaccination sites than at any point in the programme, operating 12 hours a day, 7 days a week where possible. This includes hundreds of walk-in and pop-up sites. In every community, there should be slots available at least 16 hours a day, with some extended to 24 hours a day to support workers, such as those in the transport sector who often work unsociable hours.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Secretary of State has introduced guidance for essential caregivers so that family members can visit loved ones in care homes. I wonder, is he considering going further to guarantee the right to visit residents in care homes and patients in hospitals?
The Honourable Member makes a very good point. It is important that people get the right to visit their loved ones in care homes. That's why we've introduced guidance which says essential caregivers at all points, even during outbreaks, should get access to the care homes. There is also a process that the CQC manages for reporting those that don't. But if there are specific examples, I'm very happy for the Honourable Gentleman to write to me with details and I will follow it up.
Show the Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt.
Mr Speaker, this morning the Health Secretary has reported in the Times as saying that the NHS can learn from the way that academy chains are regulated, but he will know that the education system has no national targets. Given the NHS uses more national targets than any healthcare system anywhere in the world, will he look at the role of targets and the risk that they focus managers on bureaucratic numbers, sometimes at the expense of the quality of care to patients?
Mr Speaker, I very much agree with my right honourable friend, and as the whole House knows, he speaks with considerable experience. We do, especially as a result of the pandemic and the challenges it's created, need to do things differently, and that does require reform, and we will set out further reforms in due course. But on the issue of targets, he's absolutely right. They can play an important role, but they can also lead to poor outcomes for patients, and all these targets do need to be properly reviewed.
Just missed this. Dan Jarvis.
Mr Speaker, Sheffield's Western Park Cancer Centre is one of just 4 specialist cancer facilities in the country, but it desperately needs a £50 million upgrade. The Secretary of State will know this because I raised it with his predecessor and I wrote to him in October and again just last week. So can I ask the Secretary of State to urgently respond to the proposal, which is vital for cancer outcomes in South Yorkshire?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for that question. Firstly, we will endeavour to respond swiftly, but if he would like to meet with me in respect of capital funding and those sort of projects, I'm always happy to meet with him.
Lee Anderson.
Mr Speaker, now then the Health Secretary will be aware that the Kingsmill Hospital in Ashfield was built under a disastrous PFI deal under the last Labour government, and it now costs us about £1 million a week to service this debt. This is money that could be spent on social care in Ashfield. So will the Health Secretary meet with me to discuss how we can rid this crippling debt of £1 million a week from my trust and spend it on social care?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He's absolutely right to highlight the impact of yet another one of Labour's disastrous PFIs on the funding available to our NHS and indeed to social care. We continue to work hard to deliver our manifesto commitment to improve on those disastrous PFI schemes, and I'm very happy to meet with him to discuss it.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just last month, Luton lost an outstanding champion from the other place with the sad passing of Lord Bill Mackenzie of Luton. Just 21 months previously, he'd been diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis. And just last week, I met with the chair of the Pulmonary Fibrosis Trust, one of my constituents in Luton South, who told me that there is no current cure and for most people no known cause of this disease. So will the Minister outline what steps his department is taking to support research into a cure and to improve diagnosis, support and care for people living with pulmonary fibrosis?
Mr Speaker, can I thank the Honourable Lady for raising this in the House, and this is a very serious condition. There are far too many people suffering from this, and there does need to be more research globally, not just here in the UK, but working with our international partners on this, and it is something that I will bring to the attention of my officials and see what more we can do.
Robert Gubble.
Sadly, the situation in Scarborough and Whitby for patients seeking a new NHS dentist are no better than in St Ives, with thousands of UDAs going unused. Dentists tell me what would help is to have a date for the end of the UDA system so they can start recruiting staff and in some cases building new premises to deliver NHS dentistry to local people.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's quite right. As I said earlier in my response, the disastrous contract of 2006 is really putting perverse disincentives for NHS dentists to take on NHS work. But can I assure my honourable friend that dental practices in Scarborough are currently being commissioned by NHS England following the handing back of a dental contract. Procurement processes are in place and a new practice is set to be in place by the summer.
Thank you. We now come to the urgent question. Tobias Elwood.
Thank you for granting this urgent question, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Minister to make a statement on the migrant channel issues and the role of the military?
Robin, Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, unacceptable numbers of people continue to make the dangerous channel crossings, and last November's tragic death serve as the strongest reminder of the need to stop them. The government has been exploring every avenue to prevent further crossings and has now appointed Defence to take operational primacy for cross-channel counter-migration operations, which will see a much larger and more visible role for the Royal Navy with regards to operational planning, asset coordination and operational delivery. As explained by the Home Secretary in questions yesterday, the Home Office and Ministry of Defence have worked closely on countering the small boats challenge through the military aid to the civilian authority process. Throughout the last 12 months, Defence has provided a range of support, including the provision of surveillance aircraft, additional accommodation, planning expertise, and assisted in the delivery of trials for novel tactics to assist the Border Force and Home Office to better interdict and deter migrant vessels. Detail of how Defence will deliver and maintain primacy of cross-channel counter-migration operations going forwards is currently being worked through. The government's objective is that nobody should arrive illegally in the UK on their own terms. Thus, all vessels transporting illegal migrants across the Channel must be intercepted before or as they land. Defence is committed to delivering this step change. Detail of how this will be achieved will be made known in due course. However, the House can be reassured that Defence is working hand in hand with the Home Secretary and her department to achieve this goal, whilst ensuring the safety of all individuals involved and protecting other defence priority outputs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for that clarification. We are rightly proud of our armed forces who watch our backs and defend our interests across the world, and are equipped and trained indeed to step forward and assist other government departments in times of emergency. But the bigger picture is very clear to see. Our world is getting more dangerous and more complex. Demands on our military are increasing, not least the Royal Navy. The integrated review maps out the importance to the UK economy of retaining the freedom of the seas, increasingly challenged by China, Russia and indeed Iran. And the Defence Committee's recent review of the Royal Navy concluded that it is now too small to meet the current commitments in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Gulf, off East Africa, the Caribbean, the Arctic, and of course the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. Yet here we are, introducing another tasking, coordinating the migrant crossings response, normally the responsibility of the Home Office. Now, as he's articulated, the migrant channel issue is complex and is not likely to go away soon. It is not an acute emergency. So why is the Navy being drawn in, even in this limited capacity? But when I say limited, he said operational primacy. He's now responsible for it. There is a real danger of mission creep here, with further naval assets being sucked into this challenge. Please, can the Minister explain who will pay for this mission? What does success look like? How long will the tasking last? This tactic may, on the face of it, look popular, with 28,000 migrants now crossing every year. Send in the Navy to sort it out. But it is not the strategy that will solve the movement of migrants. We firstly need to break up those gangs that encourage migrants in the first place. And secondly, and finally, Mr. Speaker, by actually helping to restore governance and security in the very countries that its people are fleeing from. Places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya and Somalia. Ironically, parts of the world where we've used our own hard power to intervene, but then departed before there was enduring stability and now their families are fleeing towards Europe. Until these fires are put out at source, we will never reduce the numbers. We need a broader strategy that simply tasking the Navy to the Channel will not be the answer for.
Mr. Speaker, thank the right honourable gentleman for further elaborating on his question. I take issue with his point that the Navy has to make a binary choice between work at home and work overseas. There are ships deployed all over the world right now. There are other ships making ready to set to sea in response to whatever crises may unfold in the Euro-Atlantic over the coming weeks. And then in addition to that, there is the capacity to do, as we do year-round, which is to deploy naval resources into the Channel for purposes such as fishery protection and indeed for securing our border. And that, Mr. Speaker, is an important point. The purpose of our nation's armed forces is to secure the UK's national security interests both at home and abroad. And I would argue that deploying our armed forces in order to ensure that our borders are robust is indeed a perfectly appropriate use of them. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, as I know the right honourable gentleman is very aware of, there are parts of Europe right now within which state-sponsored illegal migration is being used as a sub-threshold weapon of competition. Now, I'm not for a second suggesting that the migration across the Channel is right now that. But in the absence of a robust defence of our borders, it could be in the future, and I think, therefore, the MOD has a perfectly reasonable role to play in ensuring that our borders are robustly protected. He asked, Mr. Speaker, very specifically about pay. Clearly, this will be a multi-agency effort under Royal Navy Command. Where agencies are already doing things in the Channel, they will continue to be funded by the departments that own them. Success is that we don't allow anybody to land in the UK on their own terms. For how long? Until the deterrent effect is achieved and the cross-channel crossing route for small boats collapses. And as for the wider system, Mr. Speaker, I mean, there's a limit to his question, which is what is the role of the Royal Navy and the military within the Channel, which I'm here to answer today. But I completely agree with him that this is just one part of a wider system, and indeed he is right to note that indeed the MOD has plenty of equities in providing the stability in countries like Iraq and in the Sahel, where the majority of migrants are coming from, and indeed we're engaged in that. Nobody's pretending, Mr. Speaker, that the presence of a Rear Admiral and a few extra Royal Navy ships solves this as an issue. It's regrettable that only part of the government solution should appear in the papers. I'll do my best to answer the questions the right honourable gentleman provides.
Now we come to the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government really is now desperate. Desperate to distract attention from accusations about the Prime Minister lying and partying in Downing Street. Desperate to prop up a Home Secretary utterly failing for 2 years as the number of cross-channel migrants has tripled. Mr. Speaker, the military are there to protect the nation, not to protect Tory ministers. The minister has confirmed today that the armed forces will be involved in what he calls operational delivery. He says the details are still being worked through. Let's try again. What will the armed forces now do? Will naval vessels be deployed in the Channel? Will the Navy be used to push back migrant boats? Will the Navy use sonic weapons, as Number 10 wants them to do? Will they step up the use of drones for surveillance? Will they transport migrants from British beaches? And what military accommodation will be used to house and process migrants? Mr. Speaker, we're told that Rear Admiral Utley by the media has been put in charge. Who will he report to? The Home Secretary or the Defence Secretary? This announcement is the official confirmation the Home Secretary is failing. Our armed forces are always the government's last resort. The Military Aid to Civil Authorities Code, the MACA Code, means they're only granted when, I quote, the civil authority lacks the necessary capability to fulfil the task. Who will pay the military's bills for this work? What will be the arrangements between the UK and French military over cooperation? Now, the Minister, can I remind him, last month in this House Mr. Speaker, promised me that he will publish details of MACA tasks on a fortnightly basis beginning in January 2022, and these updates will be placed in the Library of the House. When will he actually do this? And will he publish the detailed terms of this MACA agreement? Finally, Mr. Speaker, the Navy was used before in 2019. 2 patrol vessels were redeployed from defence tasks to the Channel. They intercepted no boats at a cost of £780,000 to the taxpayer. Madness. Will the Minister guarantee that this military deployment in the Channel will not compromise our armed forces in any of their fundamental defence tasks? And when will the Home Secretary step up to do her job to secure a proper security agreement with the French, break the smuggling gangs and prevent more tragic deaths of migrants in the Channel?
Thank the right honourable gentleman for his questions. I don't share his view of the Home Secretary, who we've worked close with on a number of issues, including op-pitting over the summer, where I think she made a number of courageous decisions about how to accelerate border flow at the Barons Hotel, and indeed throughout the last year, where the MOD has been trying to support Border Force. The fact is that this is not a MACA request. This is something quite different. This is asking the Navy to take primacy from a command and control perspective, to bring to bear all of the government's maritime assets across all agencies that set to sail in order to try to cohere a more robust response at sea. And I think that that is an evolution of what we've been doing rather than a replacement of something that had been previously existing. The armed forces, as the right honourable gentleman notes, there may be a requirement for more naval assets, ships, to be in the Channel, but actually they sit too high off the water to be a credible platform from which you would cross-deck people from a dinghy to a warship. So in all probability, the presence of naval assets is probably from a command and control perspective rather than from an interdiction or interception perspective. There are probably, in fact, there are definitely better platforms within the government's inventory and things that we can lease from the open market that will be much more effective for mid-channel cross-decking under RN command and control. Neither the Royal Navy nor the Royal Marines will be engaged in pushback, but neither the Royal Navy nor the Royal Marines will be engaged in pushback, but we know that that tactic has been developed by the Border Force, and if it is applicable, will be used. The Royal Navy will not use sonic weapons. The Royal Navy or the wider military may be involved in transportation of people when they reach the shore, as they enter the processing system. There may be use for military accommodation, but again, this is a UQ responding to a partial revelation of the plan. The wider plan, I make no apology for being still in development. Rear Admiral Utley continues to report to the Fleet Commander, who reports to the First Sea Lord, who reports to the Secretary of State. Costs will lie where they fall, other than capabilities that are novel, in which case it will be a chat with the Treasury. The MOD and the Navy enjoy excellent relations with the French MOD and the French Navy. We're confident in our ability to manage the cross-channel relationships. And I apologise to the Honourable Gentleman if I promised him an update on MAC, as I forgot that I had done so. I'll make sure that's rectified.
Richard Drax.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my honourable friend's statement. I don't see any problem with the Royal Navy getting involved with this. For weeks, for years, the opposition benches included have been whinging and whining we're not doing enough. I think it's excellent the military are taking control and to coordinate all the assets that we have. It makes perfect sense. My question to my honourable friend, when a ship intervenes, someone in the middle of the Channel, will they have the power to take them back to France, where legally they should be, or do we have to take them into our country and then face all the problems of removing them if indeed they shouldn't be here?
Mr. Speaker, no, there is no power to enter another country's sovereign waters to return. The evolution in the capability or the command and control that we're talking about is, we believe, that if there is a more robust response at sea so that nobody lands on their own terms and they enter a process in the United Kingdom that may take them to returns or to some other outcome, that very quickly, the evidence in Australia and elsewhere is, that very quickly has a deterrent effect. But, Mr. Speaker, I am answering questions on merely a part of the plan, and the House can sense my discomfort at being unable to illuminate them fully.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Dave Dugan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me start by underlining what a worrying development this is from the government, both operationally and morally. It's immediately apparent, to say the least, what the motivation to militarise this situation of desperate people taking perilous crossings to reach safety and security. This is military camouflage being used to disguise a political crisis at the heart of government. We're talking about the Ministry of Defence, Mr. Speaker, charged with the defence of the state and its people against external state or terrorist malign activity, threat or attack. Not in any recent cogent assessment has the MOD or our armed forces been reconfigured to protect the state against civilians. So can the Minister update the House on the critical analysis being undertaken within the Admiralty over whether to undertake significant maritime operations fraught with operational and reputational risk to the Royal Navy on civilian subjects? And can he confirm that this Home Office request goes way beyond the realms of military aid to civilian authorities and represents instead an alarming, politically expedient morphing of a civilian crisis into an entirely inappropriate military operation, which is doomed to fail?
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I just take issue with the premise of the honourable gentleman's question up front, which was that people need to get into a small boat to find sanctuary. They're coming from France. That is a safe country. So those who continue their journey do so because they want to be in the United Kingdom, not because they are scared of where they are. The MOD, and the idea that the MOD isn't configured to protect against civilian threats. Mr. Speaker, we've just been through 2 decades, firstly of counterinsurgency, and then secondly of reconfiguring to deal with the emergence of sub-threshold threats. Threat no longer wears a uniform or drives around in a military vehicle that is painted and flies a flag. It is increasingly likely that the threats that are posed to the United Kingdom are not from military sources, and actually the Ministry of Defence, charged with the defence of the homeland, of course has a role to play in ensuring that our borders are more robustly protected.
Mark Francois.
I welcome this announcement that the military are finally being brought in to supersede Border Force, or as some of my constituents refer to it, Taxi Force. But in order to add credibility to this announcement, can I ask, one, what operational name is being given to this mission? 2, which armed forces units are likely to be involved? And thirdly, if they're not going to be involved in pushback and they're not going to deploy sonic weapons, what are they actually going to do?
Mr. Speaker, my former boss on the Energy and Climate Change Select Committee is sure he knows the name of the operation. I'm afraid he's wrong. The name of the operation is Isotrope. The units involved, in all probability, initially will be some of the Batch 1 offshore patrol vessels that are permanently committed to home waters, probably with some P2000s. But as I said earlier on in response to the Shadow Secretary's question when he pointed out that military warships have not been applicable in doing cross-channel mid-channel cross-deckings previously, the height off the water makes them an inappropriate platform to actually be hands-on doing the process. So it's a command and control role, if indeed anything at sea. The reality is the government has, as I think the Right Honourable Gentleman probably appreciates, has a very large inventory of maritime assets. And we would argue that if the full spectrum of those maritime assets were brought to bear on this problem and cohered under a military command structure, then actually that does provide a step change in capability. Now, the Right Honourable General will be disappointed that the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines will not be using pushback tactics or sonic weapons or whatever else. But as I was clear with previous questions, Border Force have been trialling those tactics. They may have a purpose. That's all part of the military estimate that is ongoing. But I would argue that the deterrent effect is achieved not just by the ability to push back mid-channel with all of the problems that come with that, but if you can guarantee that nobody gets to land on their own terms in the UK, and the system beyond that is effective at delivering an outcome that acts as a deterrent for those making the decision to put themselves in the hands of the people traffickers, then this is an approach that could and should work. But the Right Honourable Gentleman will be frustrated that I am unable to unveil the full scope of the plan, partly because I don't know it, secondly because I think it's something the Prime Minister will like to do himself later in the month.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister said in his remarks that the Royal Navy will not be using sonic weapons, but the sonic weapons, the long-range acoustic weapons, are already fitted to Border Force vessels. So as the Royal Navy has now assumed operational control of Border Force, can he make the statement that no Border Force weapons, sonic weapons, will be used for migrant crossings? And will he publish a rule of engagement for using sonic weapons against civilians? Because even the leaking and the spinning of this suggests a really dark force that we don't need in this debate.
Mr. Speaker, I take the Honourable Gentleman's point. If Border Force vessels are fitted with a capability that the Royal Navy commander feels inappropriate for use, then he won't direct that it is used. But that is his judgment in the MOD, as I think he probably appreciates, being the proud MP of the Royal Navy in Devonport. We deal with operational mission command. They use their judgment to bring to bear what they think is best, and I trust Rear Admiral Utley entirely to make the right decisions with that regard. I'll be honest with you, Honourable Gentleman, I'm not entirely clear what the custom is with regards to publishing rules of engagement. Perhaps he'll let me write to him with that in due course.
Bowie. Very much, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend give a guarantee that no resource, be that manpower nor asset, will be removed from another theatre that an already overstretched Royal Navy is deployed to at the minute, carrying out its primary roles of protecting the UK, its interests, and those of our allies around the world?
Mr. Speaker, I can. Commander UK Strike Force is a UK-based two-star commander, as I suspect the Honourable Gentleman knows as a former Navy man, and the ships that are being talked about as possibly having utility in this context are already committed to home waters.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you. Well, there we have it. We have number 10 yesterday briefing out that this is the new tough approach to migrants. And the Minister comes to the dispatch box today saying he hasn't got a clue what the plan is or what is actually being proposed. He's just mentioned about the deployment of assets. We had 9 OPVs until 2019 when HMS Clyde was decommissioned. The others are committed overseas, include the Pacific, and in home waters for doing tasks like fishery protection. So what added assets are there? There aren't any. And can I just check 2 other things? One, will the Navy have to abide by, and will they abide by, the UN conventions around dealing with people in distress at the street? And secondly, he says that Rear Admiral Utley will now answer to the Defence Secretary. Is he actually saying to the House the MOD has now taken over control of this entire Border Force, the Border Force and this operation, and the Home Secretary has got no role now to play in it? Is the line of command, is that the case? If that's the case, that's a huge kick in the teeth for the Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, firstly, on the Right Honourable Gentleman's point about OPVs, the OPV fleet is well deployed around the world. As he knows, Trent is in Gibraltar, having just got back from the autumn in the Gulf of Guinea. Medway is in the Caribbean. Forth is in the Falklands, and Tamar and Spey are out in the South Pacific and Far East. There are further than that 3 Batch 1 OPVs that continue and are routinely deployed in homeland, in home waters. And that's not just for fishery protection, as the Right Honourable Gentleman sought to characterise. They routinely take on the role of fleet-ready escort and are used for whatever is required in order to protect the United Kingdom's interests in her home waters, and this very clearly comes within that bracket. I'm disappointed that he felt it necessary to ask whether the men and women of the Royal Navy would still feel bound by their compulsion under the Saving Life at Sea Convention. Of course they would. The Chief of the Defence Staff is a sailor. Rear Admiral Utley obviously is a sailor. They have all been clear throughout that military involvement in this is around delivering a robust plan, but they will not endanger life at sea. He asked a question about the way that all of this reflects in government policy and ownership of the policy. I would reflect back to him that Rear Admiral Utley is a sailor working within the MOD for a part of our border protection that has been placed into the hands of the Royal Navy. He clearly reports through his chain of command to the Secretary of State for Defence. But that is not the totality of the government's migration policy, nor the totality of the role in protecting our borders. And very obviously, the Home Secretary owns the wider system, and she's doing a good job in doing so.
So Desmond Swade.
Didn't Operation Sophia in the Mediterranean teach us that increased efficiency of interception leads to an increased number of attempted crossings? This policy will have the reverse effect of that intended, won't it?
No, I don't think that that is the case, Mr. Speaker, because there was a key difference with Op Sophia, and that is what happened when people landed on the European continent and what EU nations did with them thereafter.
Diane Abbott.
The Minister will be aware that in 2019, 2 Navy patrol vessels were deployed in the Channel to deal with Channel crossings, yet they intercepted no boats and it cost the taxpayer £780,000. What will be different this time?
Mr. Speaker, it's unclear whether the Right Honourable Lady is reading from Hansard, because that's exactly the question that was asked by her front bench spokesman that I've answered already.
No. Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Behind the criminal gangs often lies the root causes of disease, famine, poverty, poor governance, conflict and war. And we've heard reference today Syria, Iraq and Libya. He mentioned the Sahel. Can I ask him what discussions he's had with his defence counterpart in the French government about President Macron's decision to withdraw the 5,000 troops based currently in Sahel, which of course is going to stretch UK armed forces further in that important region?
Mr. Speaker, we speak to our French counterparts very regularly, and on the Sahel, that is a very frequent topic of conversation. The French would argue that they're going through a transition from one operation to another, from Barkhane to Takuba, but that is clearly a decision for France. The UK's commitment in the Sahel through the UN peacekeeping mission Operation MINUSMA and our support to the French Op Nucum remains in place. But it won't surprise the honourable gentleman to know that the UK is looking for opportunities all the time to do more in Western Africa. We recognise that instability in the Sahel poses a direct threat to the UK's interests. Indeed, were it not for the telegraphing of the Right Honourable Gentleman's intent to ask the UQ, I would have been in Accra today having exactly those conversations. But it's a pleasure to be here answering this question.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome what the Minister says about not using sonic weapons, an idea which is described by a Home Office source in the press today as being, and I quote, effing bonkers. When the Home Office are telling you that your idea can be classified as that, then you have to think you've taken a wrong turn in your planning somewhere.
Very true.
But can I press the Minister on the relationship between the Royal Navy and the Marines on the one hand and UK Borders Force on the other? He tells the House, and I welcome the assurance, that the Royal Navy will not be engaged in pushing back boats with refugees in them, but it leaves open the door that the UK Border Force might still. In that case, how can he possibly say that operational primacy sits with the Royal Navy?
Well, Mr. Speaker, firstly, on his suggestion that there should be some disagreement between departments, I can only reflect that my great friends, the honourable members for Corby and Torbay, work with me all the time, not just on this, but on op-pitting and all sorts of other issues where the Home Office and MOD interests align. He's right to note that what I was clear about is that Border Force are developing a tactic. It may well be that the commander is comfortable with that tactic being employed. And there is a difference between why the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines will not deploy that tactic and why Border Force may. And that is because Border Force have potentially the appropriate vessels to do so safely. The Royal Navy and the Royal Marines do not.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Minister whether he considers that use of the Royal Navy will indeed reduce the number of migrants that land in the United Kingdom?
I believe that it could, as part of a wider system that is under development.
Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He calls it Operation Isotrope, I think. Not isotope, isotrope, isn't it? Which having properties that apply in all directions. That pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? But the honest truth is, it's Operation Red Meat, isn't it? And it has absolutely no beef in it whatsoever. Nothing has changed. There's no plan. He admits it himself. The government has completely failed to tackle what is a real issue, which many of our constituents worry about. And the people who bear the brunt of all of this danger are the people who are being illegally trafficked themselves. Many of them in miserable situations. What the government needs to do is sort out the relationship with France, make sure we have a proper deal with the whole of the European Union so people can go back to the country where they were originally landed. But can he please explain to me one phrase that he has used repeatedly today, which is that they're going to stop people landing on their own terms? What on earth does that mean?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I think that there's a lot of questions coming from the other side about the incompleteness of a plan. I would just reflect that Labour is routinely and continually silent on what it would do to ensure that our borders are protected and that illegal migration is stopped. As for the UK-French relationship, I don't think anybody has pretended that the part of the plan that I am answering questions on today is not in and of itself the answer to this challenge. And before it, there is a responsibility to have relationships with France and the EU within which that can be discussed. And there's a requirement to attack the criminal networks that do the trafficking. And there's a requirement to deal with migration flows in the first place. What land on their own terms means is that nobody gets to set foot on United Kingdom soil without having been intercepted and brought ashore by the Royal Navy or other agencies, and they are then put into a system thereafter which I have every confidence will act as a deterrent to make the cross-channel route collapse thereafter.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I declare an interest as a serving naval reservist. Now, I do appreciate the Minister's been bounced into this, but he must have a plan. Could he say when that plan will be available? And will he say on what date command and control of this operation will chop from the Home Office to the Ministry of Defence?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman, I don't know if he's asking me whether to better articulate the MOD's plan, which I've been trying to do, or whether he's, and I'm happy to elaborate on further, or whether he's asking me to elaborate on the wider plan, which regretfully I'm not able to do. The MOD's plan is to bring all of the government's inventory, maritime inventory, under the command of Commander UK Strike Force. We believe that if all of those assets were better cohered, it is possible to have a more robust interception capability in the Channel. That clearly then feeds into a wider requirement that other government departments are engaged in delivering to make sure that what happens next, combined with that certainty about our ability to intercept at sea, provides the deterrent that we've been looking for the last year. The plan is that this primacy is in place by the end of the month.
Alison Poulos.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister seems to forget the desperation of the people making these crossings, and if there are an alternative safe and legal routes, doesn't he think that people would take them rather than risking their lives in this way? And can I ask the Minister, is he aware that Human Rights Watch has condemned the regular and persistent degrading treatment of adults and children in Calais by the French authorities? It's hardly a safe country for them.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I was Mr Speaker, her final point about France being a dangerous place, that feels like something that is, well, Mr Speaker, France is, in my view, an entirely safe country. Migrants do not need to put themselves into the hands of people traffickers to be smuggled across the Channel, and I hope that they will soon see that there's no point in doing so because they don't get to enter the UK on their own terms if they do.
Lee.
In the absence of ministers having the political will to use pushback, what is the point in appointing a Royal Naval Admiral to help Border Force to be a more efficient taxi service so that the migrants will know that now we've got the Royal Navy going to pick us up and we'll be taken safely to the UK and will be put in a hotel and will never ever be sent home? This is just an embarrassment. Will the Minister now coordinate with his colleagues to do what we've been suggesting for months now, and that we get rid of the pull factors? Namely, we reform any piece of legislation that is necessary, including the Human Rights Act, and people who do this illegal crossing are arrested, put in a prison and then deported.
Mr Speaker, his exhortations and those of colleagues have been heard.
In Lavery.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just on a point of clarification, the reason why there's lots of questions from this side is because it's an urgent question. That's what we're doing here. Mr Speaker, I would like to ask the Minister if indeed this government has seriously been considering using the sonic boom weaponry against people seeking to come to this country in already hazardous conditions in the Channel. Can the Minister please explain to the House what impact this sonic boom weaponry has when used on individuals? And can I say, Operation Red Meat or Operation Save Big Dog, whatever you want to call it, it's not in my name.
Mr Speaker, I think his last point is self-evident. The use of sonic weapons is something that people have been exploring around government. The Royal Navy is clear that they won't be used by the Royal Navy, and as the operation will be under Royal Navy Command, it will be down to the Royal Navy Commander whether he wishes other agencies to use them.
Sir John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The people that come here genuinely seeking sanctuary, fair persecution, deserve our compassionate care. The people traffickers and those rights lawyers who encourage, facilitate and give succour to people who know that they're not seeking asylum, who are economic migrants, deserve our condemnation. The Minister has made clear that this proposal can only be part of the solution. Would he arrange for a Minister, possibly the Home Secretary, to come to the House to reassure us that offshore processing, the deportation of illegal immigrants, and that secure accommodation for those awaiting deportation form part of this policy? And may I say, in addition, as my right honourable friend has just said, we have to bring forward the reform of the Human Rights Act and other legislation as a matter of urgency.
Mr Speaker, the right honourable gentleman will be pleased to know that he can expect to hear exactly what he hopes for very soon. It's unfortunate that today I've required to come and expose a part of the plan early, but that is my duties to you, Mr Speaker, and to the House. There will be a wider exposition of the plan in due course, I am certain.
And McLaughlin.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I find it difficult to coordinate the glasses and the mask.
The Royal Navy website says whether disasters are human-made or natural, responding to these life-threatening scenarios is central to our ethos. And given that this government itself has decreed that, contrary to what the honourable gentleman just said, almost 2/3 of people crossing the channel in these small boats are so-called genuine asylum seekers. This government says this. Does he agree that any genuinely responsible politician would refuse to be involved in further endangering the lives of these desperately vulnerable people? And before he accuses me of reading from Hansard, as he did so rudely, I feel, with the Right Honourable Member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, he said today that the Navy will not be involved in the pushback of people. But we all know that could change tomorrow. So could he put on the record his agreement that to have our Navy involved in pushing people back into dangerous waters would directly contradict that noble ethos?
Mr. Speaker, I have somewhat more confidence in the Royal Navy than the Honourable Lady. I am absolutely certain that they can operate in the Channel robustly in the nation's interests, but compassionately, and they are absolutely clear that as mariners in the Royal Navy, with all of the fine traditions of that service, their job is not to threaten the life of innocent people at sea, and they won't do so. And as for her point around Royal Navy vessels or Royal Marines vessels being involved in pushback, I think I've been very clear from the dispatch box that that will not happen. It can't happen. The vessels are inappropriate for the practice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we are determined to smash the gangs that charge desperate people thousands of pounds to take on a perilous journey. But actually, it would be better if they didn't try and take that hazardous journey in the first place. So what discussions has my honourable friend had with the French military to make sure they intercept these boats before they set off and return them to France where they should belong?
Mr. Speaker, clearly that is a conversation we will be having, we would like to have. In reality, however, all of that, I think, remains with the Home Secretary, and I know she remains engaged with it.
Paul Blomfield.
Speaker, this is fast becoming as ludicrous as it is disturbing. Yesterday, the Home Secretary was unable to explain what the military could do but Border Force couldn't. And the Minister's failed again today. Everybody knows that this announcement coming at this time is part of the campaign to save the Prime Minister's job. How does the Minister think the armed forces feel about being used for that purpose?
Mr. Speaker, the Chief of the Defence Staff has been involved in all of the conversations, and as I've been very clear, we shouldn't be dismissive of the importance of securing our borders, not only from an immigration perspective, but from a national security perspective. Migration is being used as a sub-threshold weapon of competition elsewhere in Europe, and it can't endure that our border is not properly secured. So, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman asks what is the mindset of the military in response to this. I can tell him that from the nation's most senior service person downwards, they take great pride in making sure that they play their part in the plan of delivering what the democratically elected government sets as its priorities.
Mr. Speaker, this isn't Operation Red Meat, it's Operation Dog's Dinner. If the mission statement were to reduce the level of illegal people trafficking across the Channel, I would support it. But the mission statement, as far as I understand it, is to lower the number of people landing on their own terms on UK beaches. So what the Minister has effectively announced with the deployment of Royal Naval vessels is that asylum seekers only need to get halfway across the Channel before being intercepted by the Royal Navy under Royal Navy command. This is going to incentivise people traffickers. They'll see the Royal Navy ship on the horizon and they'll say, point your dinghy in that direction, you only need to get halfway and the Royal Navy will pick them up. The only way this will work is if the Royal Navy intercepts asylum seekers and returns them back to France. Without the second bit, this simply won't work.
Well, the honourable gentleman knows that the last bit would be impossible without French permission, and French permission has not been given. But I don't accept his characterisation of what is being spoken about today. The MOD's mission is to make sure that nobody arrives in the UK on their own terms. What happens? It means that nobody arrives in the UK without having been intercepted at sea or as they land. What happens next, Mr. Speaker? He'll just have to wait a short while, and I'm sure all will become clear.
Angus Brendan, my name.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to see my old colleague from the Climate Change Committee doing so well in government. He'll be aware, of course, there's a vacancy coming at the top quite soon, and I have high hopes for him that he will indeed go further. I actually welcome that this really hasn't been thought through very much, and it's just like the rest of Operation Red Meat, to be honest. And I'm glad the Minister is also indicating that the Navy won't actually intercept the small boats unless, of course, there's a risk, I would hope, to life and there was people in distress. But because around the world, small boats have to be avoided for the terrorist risk. And it isn't going to take a terrorist with a PhD to see the opportunity of some of this, and I hope that the government is seriously thinking about that. So what assessment has been made of the terrorist risk, both to the Navy and to the poor migrants who are often escaping terrorists in the first place, as well as the efforts, of course, of international arms sellers to find themselves in the Channel?
Mr. Speaker, thank you. The honourable gentleman notes that the Royal Navy won't be directly involved in the interception of ships, and as I've explained, that's really to do with the suitability of the vessel. But I wouldn't want him to think that that means that we're not intending to intercept all dinghies. We are. It's just there are better platforms to use for that under Royal Navy command and control. And he's absolutely right to identify. I think this is the point I've been seeking to illustrate around the justification for using the armed forces as part of this mission. Our adversaries, whether they are state or non-state, are very good at spotting where vulnerabilities are in countries. And I would argue that the flow of migrants has reached a point where actually it is a threat to our national security, and it is therefore entirely appropriate that the Royal Navy should play a role in the coordination of the response.
Because thank you, Mr. Speaker. Any of my constituents watching these exchanges will note the comments of members opposite who were trying to pour cold water on a plan which they actually want. My constituents want to see an end to this cross-channel illegal immigration. They will also be disappointed to hear from the Minister that plans are not yet finalised, because hints and announcements have been made about the use of the Navy for many months now, indeed probably even years. Now, our military are very adept at being able to put together plans quickly to respond to emergency situations. Can you at least give my constituents some hint of when a robust policy will be in place and the Navy will be involved?
Mr. Speaker, very imminently indeed, and I would certainly imagine within the next few weeks.
Jerry Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In all of the awful answers the Minister has given, he's not shown one iota of empathy for desperate people putting their own lives at risk in order to try to get to a place of safety, many of them coming from war zones around the world that Britain has been involved in. Can he not show some humanity and sympathy to these people? Come to a European-wide agreement on support for asylum seekers and refugees. Look at the sources of why people come, and look at the awful conditions that many face when they arrive in this country. These are human beings trying to survive in a very difficult world. History will judge very harshly those governments that have used military means to repel refugees at a time of a refugee crisis around the world. Let's have some humanity and not just reach out to the military all the time.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that it was very much his policy as Leader of the Opposition to not use the military at all, and probably to defund it as a consequence. I reject, however, the suggestion that what guides us in wanting to do this is not a deep sense of compassion. The Right Honourable Gentleman is correct in observing that these people are desperate. So desperate, in fact, that they are putting themselves in the hands of exploitative criminal gangs who put them to sea in dinghies, increasingly in sea states that those dinghies are woefully ill-equipped to deal with. The responsible, compassionate thing to do is to respond to this threat robustly in order to provide a deterrent so that people no longer put themselves in the hands of the criminal gangs. That is exactly what we're doing. And Mr. Speaker, if you'll indulge, on a final point, the idea that conflicts in which I proudly served, and so did hundreds of thousands of other British service personnel, are somehow the cause of why people are coming here now is utterly for the birds. Our nation's armed forces are engaged around the world trying to provide stabilisation and security in some of the countries that need it most, precisely so people don't feel they need to take on the perilous journey across continents to the United Kingdom.
Joanna Chorry.
Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Chair of the Defence Committee on securing this question? He says that this plan's not a long-term solution, and he's absolutely right about that. Now, as Deputy Chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, I've been pushing for the Home Office to consider our recommendation that claims to the UK asylum system be able to be made from France, because these people are desperate, and the reason they're desperate is because there's a dearth of safe legal routes to the United Kingdom. So can the Minister tell us what discussions he's had with the Home Office about this possibility as a long-term solution to the problem, and one that would free up the Royal Navy for more appropriate duties?
Hear, hear.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Home Office is sat beside me, and as the Honourable Lady was asking her question, I was told that the French Minister of the Interior has said in the French Parliament that her proposal would be completely unacceptable to France.
Andrew MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is clearly red dog or dead dog. I don't know what it is. Red meat. But it's an embarrassment. It's a total embarrassment. Mr. Speaker, Pope Francis has denounced narrow self-interest and nationalism over the way European countries treat migrants, and countries who persist in treating the problem as a matter that does not concern them. Isn't it time, as the Pontiff says, to treat our sisters and brothers seeking sanctuary with compassion, and time to attack the root causes and not the people who pay the consequences?
Mr. Speaker, I'd argue that's exactly what our policy does. We are engaged around the world through our aid and military efforts to provide security and stabilisation in the countries from which most people are fleeing. And I think that the work of our armed forces and the brilliant people in the FCDO who do international development are succeeding to an extent, but there's much more to be done. There are then criminal gangs who are exploiting the most vulnerable, and it is right that we and our partners around the world get after those gangs to stop them from the work that they do, because it is deeply insidious and malign. But it is also our responsibility to the people of this country to ensure that our borders are secure. And that is for two reasons. Firstly, because I think it acts as a deterrent for those who are in France and considering making an illegal crossing that will cost them their life savings and risk putting them to sea in a boat that is woefully ill-equipped for the sea state. And secondly, because the people of the United Kingdom want control over their borders. They want control over migration, and this government is committed to delivering that.
Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. It's disappointing he hasn't ruled out pushback in his answers to questions, because it poses an obvious danger to life. Navy sources, in response to the announcement this weekend, have said that they deem it to be unethical. Therefore, if Border Force were to implement this policy and a small boat was to capsize, what would be the policy for Border Force staff?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I've been clear is that the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines won't use the tactic, principally because they simply don't have the platforms that are appropriate for doing so. Arguably, the Border Force do, and they've been doing trials with it, and so it remains an option. But let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, there are parts of the Channel in which it definitely cannot be done, and there is a small part of the Channel in which it might be possibly done, and that's for the Navy Commander to consider in due course. Mr. Speaker, I think that having a a robust response that starts with the guarantee that we will intercept all boats either at sea or as they land, and then bringing people into a system that itself acts as a deterrent is the right way to go. The people want the government to get control of our borders. It is the Prime Minister's, one of the Prime Minister's top priorities. The MOD has a part of that plan which we're confident in our ability to deliver. The rest of the plan will be unveiled in due course.
Thank you. But in reality, since 2014, over £200 million has been given to France, around £500,000 a week of taxpayers' money, yet crossings are increasing. And this latest announcement will do absolutely nothing to halt those dangerous crossings. The Minister and Government need to be smashing the criminal gangs. That's the reality. This is just red meat headlines, but more of the same failed policy.
So, Mr. Speaker, the government's introducing life sentences for people smugglers, and we agree vigorously with the honourable gentleman that the absolute key to this is to get upstream of the problem, prevent the migration flows in the first place ideally, get straight after the organised crime gangs to attack the network in secondary. That is very much part of the plan, not necessarily a part of the plan that the MOD owns, as you would expect. That is much more neatly sits within the Home Office, the National Criminal Agency and the Foreign Office when it comes to some of the diplomacy. But as I've been clear throughout, suboptimal, Mr. Speaker, that I should only be able to unveil our part of the plan in response to an urgent question today. But in due course, the full system will be made clear.
Martin Docker to use.
I think nearly 5 years on the Defence Select Committee, Mr. Speaker, has demonstrated to me the woeful legacy that a decade of cuts to non-frontline services means that there's probably little option for this. And my Defence Select Committee subcommittee on the contracted services to the Ministry of Defence has also shown the pernicious effect of outsourcing services such as those, for example, at HMS Naval Base Clyde, which affected so many of my constituents. So can the Minister give their word to the House today that there will be no private sector involvement in Operation Isotrope? Because if there's one thing we and the poor souls in the Channel don't need, is for Serco and for Capita to get their tentacles into a very lucrative government contract.
Mr. Speaker, about 45 minutes ago, I was clear that actually there would be leased platforms that were far more appropriate for use in the Channel. But, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman